I want to first of all, I just want to reiterate thank you to all of our caregivers who took the time out of their evenings to be with us. I really appreciate everyone being here. Hope that you're getting a little something out of it. I want to talk specifically about what actually happens. What does it look like when you have a concern about adult abuse and neglect? What are your roles and responsibilities? What is happening behind the scenes when you do some of that? You know, when you have those concerns. I spent my previous professional life, I worked in children, youth, and family services in Larimer County, Colorado. And my team of intake workers were the folks who would man the child and adult protection hotline calls. Annually, we took about 10 to 12,000 total hotline calls from mandated reporters, doctors, physicians, nurses, coroner, lawyers, attorneys, therapists, as well as just people in the general population, the community that, it might be someone across the street, a neighbor, or a family friend who might be concerned about them. There's some specific aspects of those calls that I want to walk you guys through and kind of give you a little, expand on your understanding of adult protection reporting and what it entails beyond what you may have just received in your orientation as a caregiver or in some other class. So what is adult abuse? I think we all have a fairly good understanding of what types of abuse there are. We all, I would say the hair on the back of our neck stands up, so to speak, whenever we feel we have a concern about potential neglect or someone may be at high risk of victimization based on how they're acting or their day-to-day routine. Legal definition of adult abuse: non-accidental, known or reckless infliction of bodily injury, serious bodily injury, or death. The types of abuse: it can be physical abuse, it can be hitting, slapping, pinching, kicking, sexual abuse, inappropriate touching, or on up to full penetration. And then various types of emotional abuse, name calling, threatening, making threats for change in behavior. If you don't do this, this is what I'll do. That type of thing. Belittling, put downs. Neglect. There's physical, environmental, medical neglect. There's various subspecies of neglect, so to speak. Medication mismanagement can be construed as medical neglect, not appropriately responding to injuries or physiological changes in condition. That can be physical neglect, as well as environmental neglect. Dangers to the environment, such as exposed wiring or stairs that might be breaking or cracking, various types of neglect. Then financial exploitation that generally occurs. I would say the majority of financial exploitation reports that I took over my 20 years with adult protection was an adult son or a daughter who is not the financial power of attorney, draining account or being over at the house and taking belongings while other siblings were not in the house, just generally taking things from the parent's home or the parent's bank account without permission to do so, without the power of attorney to do so. And then finally, self-neglect. Self-neglect can be a slippery slope by legal definition for adult protection. You know, there is a fine line. There's a line, there's a threshold that one must cross before it can be something that adult protection can act on. You know, there's the consideration of an adult's level of cognitive functioning and self-will. I lost track of the number of referrals that we had taken from upset sons and daughters saying, you know, mom or dad is literally drinking themselves to death. Is there nothing that you guys can do to prevent this from happening? And that introduces, you know, there is self-efficacy, self-will that adult protection cannot infringe upon, meaning adult protection cannot take actions based on a person's lifestyle choices. So, yeah. Moving along, I wanted to give you guys a couple of key important links. If you ever had a client that you feel has been victimized or is the alleged victim of any type of abuse, we've got the mandated reporter requirements for all 50 states. You click on that link, it will give you state by state who is mandated reporter and what contacts are there. The second link, state contacts for adult protection. It's just a map of the U.S. You click on the state that you live in. It includes names, phone numbers. It gives you the hotline number that you need to call to go ahead and make that report. So all of this information pertains to the mandatory reporting statutes of elder abuse in the U.S. So all states have mandatory reporting statute for elder abuse. And earlier this week, I did go through all 50 states, and loosely defined, I can say that caregivers are very much, in fact, mandated reporters in all 50 states. So what that means for everybody listening right now is that you are a mandated reporter. When you see what you deem to be abuse or neglect of an elder, anyone, elderly, child protection, anyone of any age, you have a legal obligation to call the appropriate people and report that. Let's see. That's all I'm going to say about that. So, how do we determine abuse, neglect, as opposed to something else that's going on? When you are potentially concerned that things just are not quite right at home, that this person may be the victim of maltreatment, first thing that you need to do is, of course, rule out some level, some stage of dementia or delirium. So the key here is to not investigate per se. I want to be clear with your role as a mandated reporter. A lot of times, you know, I've had conversations with some of my caregivers who were borderline concerned about a situation and would just continue gathering information. I do want to provide for the fact that, you know, it's not your job to determine, you know, is this true? Is this not true? You don't have to have something locked down, figured out what's happening before it meets the level of you having a legal responsibility. If you're hearing or seeing things that just don't measure up, just doesn't feel right in your gut, it's okay to go ahead and call and report that information. So your goal, your entire purpose when you're speaking with the client is just to gain an overall understanding, a good understanding of what the client themselves has experienced. And what I provided in this slide is just some additional information about how you would go about constructing your interview process. You don't want to go too deep in the weeds with a client. There have in the past been times where law enforcement, adult protection, they run into sticky situations legalized from a legal standpoint, just by how the victim was interviewed way at the beginning of the process. So there are steps that caseworkers and law enforcement, there's whole classes and curriculum they go through in terms of how to interview a witness so as not to lead them down one direction or another. For instance, if you see a client with a black eye and you were to ask them the very innocent question of, oh my gosh, who hit you or who hurt you? That in and of itself was a leading question. That in and of itself could, if it was ever found out, be traced all the way back to cause legal problems if any prosecution was to take place later on. So your goal is just to use very open-ended questions. Avoid yes or no questions, but ask questions that will help them tell a story. Use the client's exact words or phrases. Do not insinuate or don't use synonyms of what they've said. Whenever possible, whenever you're asking a question, it's important to say things like, earlier I heard you say that your son was there at the house with you. Was anyone else with you? That brings it back to what they've already told you and kind of prompts them to think in terms of what other information they know. Once you've asked the open-ended questions and you have a good understanding of what the general allegation is, then you want to ask more specific questions rather than broad questions. And you also want to ask clarifying questions. You know, you're ultimately wanting to find out details about the who, what, when, where, why of it. You know, if you said that your son did this, was anybody else present who could corroborate that that's what in fact happened? If you can get names, phone numbers, contact information for other people who may have seen or heard what the person, the caregiver that you spoke to saw or heard, the better off in terms of the report. It's very important with our clientele to just listen very patiently and redirect them back to the topic that you guys are discussing. As they may tend to trail off or get into storytelling about unrelated matters. Try to listen patiently, but whenever possible, steer them back to the general allegation or the concern of what they're reporting to you. Use memory cues, such as what were you doing before this happened? You know, try and create a visual picture that takes them back mentally to that time and place that they were in. Don't discount the alleged abuse just because the client has made statements that seem untrue or might be the result of delusions, we never want to assume that that's what is the case. Just because they may have suffered from delusions in the past doesn't necessarily mean that they're unclear at all now, or that something bad in fact didn't happen to them. Like I said earlier, as much as possible, get a clear understanding of the who, what, when, where. Action steps. What's required of you? So after you have this story, as soon as possible, after you've had this conversation, either with a family member of the person or the person themselves, make sure you clearly document the time, day, where you were, who was present during the interview, how they presented, as many details as you have. It's great whenever you can use direct quotes or direct statements that the victim made to you. It's also important to use, we've all had those college courses. We've all been trained in the difference between objective and subjective report writing. When you're documenting an incident report with your employer, or you're writing this down for purposes of calling an adult abuse report later on, it's very important to keep your feelings separate from what it is that you're documenting. Just direct statements: who was involved, who said it, then what happened, then what did you ask, then how did they respond, where were they, etc., etc. Once all of this is done, once your shift is ended, or you have the time to make this report, it's very important to reach out to your own A Place at Home administrator and file an incident report. This is definitely something that you would want to note in change in condition. You would want to call your owner, discuss this matter with them, and complete an incident report with as much detail as you possibly could. Then after the fact, as soon as possible, definitely within 24 hours of having the conversation, but hopefully within an hour or two, you would be able to make contact with your local DHHS to file the adult abuser report. I'll talk about this a little bit more before I wrap up, but I also want to say that it's important to, acknowledge the impact that this can have on someone. As caregivers, generally speaking, 9 times out of 10, these are people who you've developed a relationship with. You care deeply for. You may even care deeply for their sons, daughters, or extended family who are in and out of the house while you're providing care for them. You have an invested interest. You have a deeply bonded relationship with them. So if in fact you were ever to encounter something that you deemed rose to the level of needing to make a report, my guess is it's going to have, it's going to bring on some strong feelings and emotions within you that are perfectly natural, perfectly okay to feel scared, anxious, anxiety. But I want to really drive home the point that this is where your employer, us as owners, can be huge resources for you. It's our job to step in, take your hand, and be the buffer between you, the caregiver, and the client, family members, whatever the case may be. Speaking for myself, and I'm sure I'm speaking for all of the other A Place at Home owners as well, something like this, it creates a lot of anxiety. It can be kind of scary and intimidating to call and make a report like this. I'm sure each and every one of us, to an owner, would say, by all means, come into the office. Let's go ahead and make a report together. I'm happy to sit down with you. And, this is something that we can go through together. So, how to prepare. After the fact, after you've completed your documentation, like I said, definitely, please enlist the help of your supervisor, your agency owner. This is not something that you have to do alone. It's also a point I want to make. We have it pointed out very well in our policies and procedures, franchise-wide. A place at home has a zero tolerance policy with any aspect of adult abuse. So you'll receive nothing but support on navigating your way through this from your owner if you ever needed to do something like this. Then behind the scenes, next step, gather all of the demographic information about the client, the alleged perpetrator, any other parties involved. You just want to make sure you're very clear whenever possible on full legal names, dates of birth, addresses, phone numbers. Just get all of that good demographic information as much as you possibly can. Get, if possible, social security number, sources of income, other things that adult protection would want to know. Have immediate access, of course, to your written notes or your incident report. Like I said earlier, time really is of the essence. It's imperative that you report what you heard within 24 hours, but definitely as soon as reasonably possible after the disclosure. And then what to expect. You'll want to find a very quiet, solitary environment where you'll be free from any interruptions for about 30 to 45 minutes. Anonymous reporting. There are a lot of questions regarding, can I report anonymously? Answer is any person making a report to APS can do so anonymously. However, the federal government leaves it state to state. Adult protection is a state-funded, state-managed program. So it varies from state to state whether or not your information is held in confidentiality as a mandated reporter. I know most states try to maintain reporter confidentiality when at all possible. However, sometimes it does come into play. I know in almost every state, I believe every state, if there was a reason for it, the court could order that the reporting party's information was released. If the validation of the report ever came under scrutiny, the court could mandate that RP's information is released. So no one can ever guarantee that you would be able to maintain complete anonymity in making your report. Whenever possible, adult protection will also attempt to use third-hand report writing. So you might be calling about a concern that you're the only person that literally could have possibly seen this information. Under those circumstances, it's generally not going to be difficult. If you're reporting about last Tuesday afternoon and that was your shift with Mr. Smith, it's probably not going to take long for the family to figure out or suspect that that it was you or a place at home that made the reports. I think that's just part of the responsibility that we bear as caregivers and caregiving agencies. All states also have strict laws about civil and criminal liability, as well as professional disciplinary action. So the so-called Good Samaritan laws, as long as you make a report of abuse or neglect in good faith, you're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to help someone, there's genuine concern on your part, you'll be held from civil and criminal liability for any aspect of your report that was deemed not to be true, as well as be free from any professional disciplinary action. If you were to tell an employer that you had adult protection concerns and they instructed you or somehow coerced you into, this might be a bad thing for you or for us if you were ever to report that information, no, that is a crime. So when you are actually making a report to the adult protection screener, I also want you to know and be very clear on this, that I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. A lot of times these intake screeners that are taking these reports from you, they have intake templates that are very in-depth. It's very rare the reporting party that will have all of the information they need. So I just encourage you, if you do find yourself on the phone making a report of abuse or neglect, and they're asking you a question that you're not sure of, I don't know. That's perfectly okay. Also, be prepared to discuss historical client and family strengths, community supports, or the absence of abuse. A lot of times, as mandated reporters, we're kind of caught off guard by that. You call expecting to report an allegation of abuse, and you might be facing questions like, tell me some of the strengths that this family has. Have you noted any positive interactions between your client and their son or daughter who is alleged to have slapped them? That can take reporting parties off guard. But the reason that a screener might be asking you a question like that is to try and determine, when did something change? Was there a precipitating event that has led up to that? Maybe an adult son was sober for several years and just recently started drinking again. So now he's verbally and physically lashing out toward mom and dad where he wasn't 3 months ago. That's why they're trying to get, do you remember a time in your relationship with this person that you did not have this concern, that the environment felt safer to you? Check. So I also want to address the social stigma of adult protection reporting. A lot of times people, it's not uncommon to say, look, I don't want to get anybody into any trouble here. I mean, what if I'm just blowing this out of proportion? What if this isn't true? What if they find out that I'm the person that reported this? It can create a lot of anxiety, and I just want to acknowledge that. And look, when you're making a report as a mandated reporter, the threshold you need to meet is the information that was being provided to you rise to the level that created concern about their physical or emotional well-being. That's it. It was not uncommon. In my years of experience, I would have reporting parties call me and say, hey, I want to run a situation by you. I don't even know if my concerns that I have here are even reportable. And what I legally was required to tell them was, if you're concerned enough about this to even call and ask, is this reportable? Then you should probably go ahead and make a report. I would actually break the law if I ever told a reporting party, no, that's not abuse. You don't have to report that. we're not going to do anything with that. That was actually against the law to do. So if anyone says you can't report that, or we're not going to do anything about that, so you don't need to report it, rest assured that's not the case. Ask to speak with their supervisor if necessary, but if it's something that you're concerned about and it rose to the level of you feeling like you needed to make a call, it's reportable. Finally, what actions will be taken by Adult Protective Services? So I'm running low on time here. I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but I also want to acknowledge that, you know, after you hang up the phone, you've made this report of abuse or neglect. The actual referral itself can fork off into many different. So that didn't come out right at all, did it? It can. Okay, it can actually. There's many different things that can happen with that referral. A team of caseworkers and supervisors can take a look at that referral, and they can determine that these allegations do not rise to a legal level that we would be able to assign to a caseworker to investigate. For instance, you know, like I was talking about earlier, we would get calls. It was routine for us to get calls and say, you know, my dad's drinking again, or he's smoking pot or whatever. I feel like this is self-neglect. I need you guys to do something about it. That involves self-will. That actually does not meet the legal definition of self-neglect. So we would FFR it. We would FFR it, meaning filed for future reference. It was screened out. We're not even assigning a caseworker to go out, speak with the client, and investigate the allegation, so to speak. Other forms of abuse or neglect would require law enforcement involvement. They would be forwarded on to local law enforcement. For instance, all allegations of sexual abuse, that's the investigation of a crime. Adult protection is more the civil side. Law enforcement is the criminal or the legal side. A lot of these types of abuse and neglect, they can be criminal in nature as well. So adult protection wouldn't be doing anything other than forwarding those reports on to law enforcement. So I appreciate your time with me. That pretty much wraps up everything that I kind of wanted to let you know. I hope that my presentation here may have taken the edge off a little bit, may have lifted the curtain a little bit, so to speak, on you know, the world of adult and child protection, what happens when you make that call, and what they're trying to do. My final thought is that a lot of times, even if a referral is assigned, adult protection will be coming from the angle of how do we help this family? How do we implement support services so that the abuse doesn't happen anymore, so the neglect doesn't happen anymore? They don't tend, whenever possible, they don't come from a punitive, okay, how do we really lay the hammer on this person? And it's more from hopefully a supportive role whenever